Chapter 17, the Enlightenment. Welcome back from your winter break, guys. We're rocking and rolling. So, fresh page, right? Chapter 17, the Enlightenment. You know, in Ohio history, Ohio public schools usually start their classes with this, but because of the way we do our program, you got to have all of the ancient history, Middle Ages up until now. So we'll be able to have context to the Enlightenment. We don't just drop you off in there. So let's put some bones on the flesh of this unit. So what is the Enlightenment? Here's a real basic definition for you. It's a European movement in which thinkers use the principles of reason to change society. So this idea that started a long time ago with the philosophers that the universe is unchanging and that if you understand the rules, then you can master them and maybe even have some control over your environment. Well, that's what the philosophers a long time ago believed, but because of a lot of the turmoil in societies, now Europeans are going to pick up where the philosophers left off, and it's going to have a massive impact on the world. Some of it awesome, some of it great, and some of it not good at all. But either way, that's the story of the Enlightenment. So again, European movement which thinkers use the principles of reason to change society. Okay, so here we go, guys. So the first term we have to deal with for this unit is called a natural law. And these are rules that are discoverable by using your reason. So these are rules that are a part of the natural system that uncover themselves if you use your intellect, use your mind. And so they believe they could change the world using these rules. So if we can discover what the natural laws are, then we can have this impact on our society, and as we change human society, we'll be able to change the planet, basically. Put up or shut up, Mr. Rico. That's what you should always be thinking. Like, what are you talking about? Changing the world. All right, so an example of how natural law has changed Europe. So smallpox, which is one of the greatest killers in all of humanity, right? Smallpox, a ruthless and brutal disease that has, some historians have said, has killed more people on the planet than anything else. Like smallpox is ruthless, it's vicious, and the people that do survive smallpox are left marred by it for the rest of their lives, or they can be. And so at that time in history, people thought that smallpox, at least some people believe, that it was spread by demons and unseeable supernatural forces that were out to get you. And so if that's the case, it's like nigh impossible to stop them, right? Because a demon would be this evil spirit that's beyond you. So basically, you just have to accept that smallpox is going to wipe out a big part of your village. Consider how much damage smallpox does to a part of the population that has zero immunity. Smallpox may have killed 90 to 93% of all of Native Americans, First Peoples, because they had no immunity to whatsoever. Now, it didn't do as much damage to Europeans because Europeans were fairly dirty people. They lived with animals, which often gave them immunities to diseases. But smallpox is a ruthless, unstoppable killer. But that's going to change with this conception of following natural laws. So, okay. Here's what happens. But once smallpox is identified as a natural process, vaccine is created, millions are saved. Well, okay, so what happens here? What Europeans start to notice is that when smallpox hits villages, it pretty much kills huge swaths of the population, but the same person in many of the villages lives. It's a person who does a job, and it's actually a female. What they started to notice is that milkmaids, the girl that's like, psh, 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 the girl who's milking the udders of the cow, she would often live. And that started the question in the minds of Europeans. Well, why is she living, right? It's a girl, often a young maiden, and why would she live? And they're like, well, what if it's not demonic? What if there's a natural process here that if we understand it, it'll make things better? And so then they started to think about it, and what they know, just because they've been around animals, is that cows get a disease similar to smallpox called cowpox. And cowpox, which was less lethal to cows than smallpox is to people, you get these large pustules that form on the cows get ill. But what they thought is, what if that is not What if that's a disease? It's a sickness. And that disease is transferring itself to these milkmaids. And then when their body gets exposed to this other thing, smallpox, their body's capable of dealing with it. And that's exactly what it is. Cowpox gives an immunity to people against smallpox. And so at that point, what they do is to test this theory that they do is they would go up to cows that had cowpox, they would scrape the pustules, they would cut people open and push that in there. And all of a sudden they start to see, wait a minute, people could still get sick and die, but it reduced the mortality of smallpox. We don't have the ability to see germs. We can't even really conceptualize germ theory, but there are small things in these animals that are killing people. And if we now accept that, we can now start to give people immunities. George Washington, our first president, famously, they had this basic idea of how this worked. He knew a person who had actually survived smallpox, and he had that person cut himself. He took some of his blood and took some of that man's blood and put it into his own blood. That is not an uncommon way that people tried to immunize themselves from this. This is where vaccines come from. The idea of a vaccine, Edward Jenner, comes from the fact that, okay, if we can take a weakened version of a virus or this thing that we can't even see yet, but we introduce it to someone else's body, their body will fight it. When the full strength version comes, boom, you save millions and millions and millions and millions of people, all because of this conception of natural law. Now, all right, so you can write down important people of the Age of Reason. This unit's a little different. There's a whole bunch of men in here that have different theories and philosophies, and we have to know them. Because, number one, because they have a big impact on the Western world, which guess what, you're a part of. But also, next year in government, a lot of the things that you're going to learn come from these people or the ideas that they're playing with. So, right, important people in the Age of Reason, we're going to start going through them. Are you ready? Let's do this. The first one is Thomas Hobbes. So who is Thomas Hobbes? Thomas Hobbes, there he is. We got this nice picture of him. Hobbes is a man who was actually born in England when this Spanish Armada, this powerful navy, was bombarding England. And so Hobbes has this natural belief, whether it was from that or something else, he believes that humans are naturally cruel, greedy, and savage. And he just says, look, humans are naturally dangerous animals. And actually, if you read his book, The Leviathan, as I recall, he says that humans in many ways are worse than, like, say, a hungry tiger. Because if you go and a hungry tiger preys upon you and it kills you, why did it do that? It did it because it was hungry, wanted to eat you. But he says, no, humans are worse. Because a human will kill you or assault you, beat you, torture you, and they'll do it for fun because that's their nature. Now, he says if you can't then control human nature, we'll destroy each other. That is the nature of man. Now, some of our founding fathers are actually Hobbesian. They believe this. And actually, some of you in the room are Hobbesian. I think part of this is our experiences. But so the question is, how do you feel what human nature looks like? Now, let's go a little further with Hobbes. Hobbes does this thing that's really important. Hobbes creates this concept, and it's called the social contract. Now, other people are going to take this ball and run with it further, but the idea of the social contract is simple. He says, look, if people are these crazy, greedy, savage, dangerous animals, then what we have to do by the nature of being what we are is we have to give up some of our freedoms. And we do this not because we're kind or good but the reason we do it is because we need to have order in society. We're going to have to give up some of our individualized freedoms so we can have a society that functions properly. And lest this sound crazy to you, just guess what? You do this all the time. So, for example, you came to school today. Did you speed? Maybe some of you did, but the vast majority of you did not. Why? Not because you didn't want to go faster, but you realized that if you violate the law, you could be arrested or get a ticket, etc., etc. you have allowed yourself, you've subordinated yourself to a social contract. You do not speed because you don't want to get in trouble. And the reason why we don't allow people to go whatever speed they want is because then there'd be dead bodies everywhere and there'd be car wrecks everywhere. The point is, we are all in social contracts. This idea, we live under this. The reason why you're in school right now, the reason why you're here is because if you weren't, then that truant's officer would come to get you. Why in our society do we not give young people the ability to do whatever they want with their time? Because young, ignorant people who don't know anything are dangerous to society. We believe as a society, we take away your freedom to do whatever you want when you're young, force you to learn, force you to become literate, force you to understand the basics of math and civilization and civics and government so you can be useful to the society, and then you get more freedoms. Then at 18, you can go do what you want. You are in a social contract, whether you accept that or not. That is the reality of it. This idea is applied. Now, I do want to cover one other part to Hobbes. Hobbes believes, because remember, he thinks people are naturally cruel, wicked, savage, dangerous. He believes that it is critical for societies to have a really strong central power. And that really means an absolute monarch. That means a monarch who has total control of society. Now, Hobbes does not want a monarch because he thinks they're good. No, Hobbes actually thinks that they are cruel, greedy, and savage too. He does not have some belief that monarchs are these divine individuals that are going to do what's right for everyone. Absolutely not. But from Hobbes' perspective, it is better to have one cruel, greedy, savage, dangerous person than millions of them surrounding you. He wants the other ones to be controlled by the powerful, the one powerful one, right? One tyrant instead of thousands of tyrants. This theme, when you read his book, if you read it in college, his book is called The Leviathan, and it makes perfect sense. A Leviathan is a gigantic, powerful creature. And the reason why he picked that for the title of his book is he believes that because of the dangerousness of human nature, that you need something strong to control them. And what you need is an absolute monarch. And by the way, that's social contract helps too. Now, we just dealt with Thomas Hobbes. Our founding fathers, many of them, were influenced by Hobbes. But many of them were also influenced by this guy, John Locke, fascinating human being, philosopher, economist, interesting man. Now, Locke goes in the other direction. Locke says, look, I believe people are born naturally good, fair, kind. He looks at tribal societies and he sees that they seem fairly equitable, right? There's equal distribution of resources, and some when some tribes, when the men go out to hunt, the women then take over control of society. And he says, look, I'm looking at tribes. Tribes seem like they're civilizations in their earlier form, and they're fair. So again, Hobbes believes people are good. Now, Hobbes comes up with an idea, and this is another one of these important concepts for understanding America and Western thought and our world, is this thing called natural rights. Natural rights are rights that you are born with, and they cannot be taken away from you. They are your gift by the fact that you are born human. You're human, you're born, you are given these natural rights. These precede government. These precede any institution. These precede the institution of even the family, right? You're born into a family unit. That's like the earliest institution. You're born with your parents, right? This is before that. You're human. And here are the three rights that he says. One is life. Two is liberty. And three is property. These are critical components of society, and no group may take these from you. They are yours. That's why they are natural upon birth. Now, and you can see this in his book, which is called The Second Treatise of Government, the second thought on government, right? And so that's his book. It's interesting because Hobbes and Locke have different views of people, but our founding fathers utilized both of them. You can see parts of both of their writings in our founding documents. Some founding fathers were more skeptical of human nature, they're Hobbesian. And then we have founding fathers who are less skeptical, they're Lockean. People in this room are probably going to fall one way or the other. Now, just to go a little bit further with John Locke so we understand him. Here's where things get crazy, and this should sound familiar to you if you know anything about American history. Again, he says people have the right to life, liberty, and property. These are your natural rights. He says the purpose of government, whatever the type of government, you've got a dynastic monarchy, an aristocracy, an oligarchy, a democracy, a republic, whatever you got going on. We get dictators coming up soon. Whatever you got, it doesn't matter. The purpose of the government is actually to protect your natural rights. Now, whatever they do then, their job is to focus on that. That is a radical conception. Because here's the thing. If the job of the government is to do that, that means the government may not only is their job to not take your rights away, but they have the obligation and the duty to protect them. And here is the crazy part. This is the part that goes way out there. And this should make sense to you being an American. He says if a monarch interferes with, or any type of government gets in the way of your rights, you have the duty, you have the obligation, you have the responsibility to destroy that government. You must destroy it because that thing is getting in the way of your natural rights. Oh, this should sound familiar because this is certainly the case that our founding fathers laid out for overthrowing the British government. King George III. You're getting in the way. If you ever read the Declaration of Independence, it's very much in there. And by the way, one thing I would tell you, John Locke's words are in the Declaration of Independence. Like you can actually hear them. Now, when Thomas Jefferson writes the Declaration, instead of saying life, liberty, and property, what does he say instead? You should know this. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So that extends that even further than just property rights. Property rights are a critical component of our economic system and, our connection to our government and the institutions that we have. But look how much further the idea of the pursuit of happiness is, that you're allowed to go out there and pursue what brings you happiness. So there we go. That's John Locke and Thomas Hobbes. Let's keep going and see what other important Enlightenment philosophers we have coming up. All right, so our next person is Baron de Montesquieu. So we need to talk about him. So what do we got here? Montesquieu, if you were in class right now, we would be doing this. Montesquieu, 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 Montesquieu. Why? Obviously, I'm not your English teacher, but he clearly has 3 syllables in his name. Montesquieu is a radical idea, which can be seen there in that slide. He believes that power in a government should check power. And check, which means to stop, to prevent. That's the only thing you can do. You have to have power in your government, prevent the overtaking of the government's power by other parts of the government. So he says, look, you can't give one person all this power. That's a train wreck coming. He says that any individual or any part of any government needs to break power up into 3 parts. You need to have a judicial branch, an executive branch, and a legislative branch. And so let me go over those with you, just so they make sense. Let's start with the executive. What's an executive? An executive is someone who executes laws. The job of an executive is someone who, when there's a law, they make sure the law gets implemented. The United States has many executives. Our chief executive is our president. But we also have an executive of our state, right? Who's the chief executive of Ohio? That's our governor. But then we even have other executives too. Like, let me give you an example of another one. What about the mayor of Cincinnati? That's another executive. Even if you were to look at this school, whose job is it to enforce rules? It's your principal. That's the idea. Now, he also says, look, you got to break up power. You also have to have a different group has to write the laws. You can't have the same person enforce the laws and write the laws. This group is called the legislature. The legislature would include the House of Representatives, and then we also have the Senate. That's on the federal level. But then many states, like all the states rather, have another state-run House of Representatives and another Senate. And then, by the way, cities have city councils. Our school has a board, people who create rules that have to be followed. That's a legislature. Anytime a group writes them down, our Congress, House of Reps, and Senate is a legislative body. And then he says, well, okay, now we need to have one more group in our society, and that is a judicial branch. The judicial branch's job is to say, look, we have someone who writes the laws, someone who executes the laws, but we also have to have someone who interprets the laws. Like, what is actually the purpose of this law? And how do we fairly interpret it to make sure that it is being applied equally within the society. That's judges. So who are some of the judges? Our highest judicial branch within the United States system, of course, is the Supreme Court, but we also have federal courts and we have appellate courts. And by the way, we have local courts and we have district courts and we have divorce courts. We have all these different things. We have state-run Supreme Courts. That's the layering of that. The reason why is Montesquieu correctly identifies is if you give one person all this power, you are going to get tyrants who rule over you. You have to spread power out. And of course, there's a country that I can think of that was certainly influenced by this, and that is the United States. So our next person is kind of a wild, crazy man. I wouldn't say he's necessarily a very good person, but he has some pretty wild viewpoints that have a big impact. One is that Jean-Jacques Rousseau says that he kind of has, he kind of takes an in-between Locke and Hobbes. So where Locke says people are born good, Hobbes believes people are born wicked. Rousseau says that people are born good, but society itself corrupts them. So there's almost like society is actually not necessarily a good thing, according to Rousseau. So he says man is born free, but everywhere he's in chains. Society destroys and makes men wicked. So he's almost an anti-society guy, almost like a proto-Marxist in some ways. So that's a pretty wild view, and I'm sure some of you in the room agree with that. So you got Locke. Now we got Hobbes, and now we got Rousseau. And then another thing he says direct democracy is the best form of government. Yeah, you hear the word democracy, think, well, that's good, right? Nah, listen to what he's saying. I mean, think about how wild this is. This is a really extreme view. He's saying direct democracy is the best form of government. What do we got, like 350 million Americans, maybe more? Imagine if we directly voted on every single thing. Oh, we need a new dog catcher here in Blue Ash? Great, vote on it. Oh, do you want the new Missile Man 3 program for our intercontinental ballistic missiles? Or should we stick with an older version of it? Or should we put more money? Should we have the F-22 Raptor or the F-35? Do you know anything about that? To have everyone voting on everything is very difficult. It is like it's that not only that, but then also gives the majority tremendous power. Remember, America is a democratic republic where we elect people to make decisions for us. And so this is a little counter to what some of the founders believe, but it is, again, he has extreme and really interesting views. The third is that men and women are equal. You're like, well, of course, Mr. Rico, we're almost in the modern world. No, that's a pretty extreme view, too, at that time, that men and women were equal. That said, he was he was kind of a player and didn't treat women particularly well, but he did say that they were equal. Adam Smith, perhaps another one of these guys that is just hyper influential, especially when it comes to the American experiment. So Adam Smith wrote a book, and this year should sound familiar to you. It's called The Wealth of Nations. The Wealth of Nations was written in 1776. And what Adam Smith is against, he cannot stand the system of way governments manipulated economies at that time called mercantilism, where the government directed where resources would go and then what things would be purchased, et cetera, and how and where things could be sold. Adam Smith says that's dumb. Forget that. What we want to have are free markets. Let the market decide. If people want to buy Pez dispensers, let them buy it. If they want to buy fidget spinners or they want to buy heating oil or milk, let people decide and decide what they want and what they want to buy and what they want to sell in as much quantities as they want, and just get out of the way. He says that by the government constantly getting in the way of these decisions, it makes economies less efficient and it prevents them expanding and growing. This concept of get your hands off of the economy is what Adam Smith calls laissez-faire. It's a French term, hands off. Our U.S. economic system is definitely influenced by this. It's not that there's no role for government, but the idea is that the larger the government's footprint in the economic sphere, the more it makes things less efficient, and it actually slows it down. This is why the United States economy explodes at this. It goes from a backwater country to a hyperpower in just over 100 years. An example I would give you is this. Like, this is a picture I took of a few years ago. This is Coke in Seattle. Seattle passed a sugar tax. And they said, well, if you want to buy Coke or anything with sugar in it, then you have to pay this tax. So here, look at this case of Coke at that time was $11, and then the person they have to pay an additional $7.35, which makes the price of the good $18.34. So what's going to happen? Are more or less people going to buy it? Less people are going to buy it. Well, Smith would say, well, you have no business being involved with that. Now, whether that's good or not, he says you have no business because what that's doing is that's slowing down the markets. That's not letting the markets go in the direction that the majority of people want them to go in. Oh, look at the Gatorade here. One's $15.99 to buy this Gatorade, and then an additional $10.34. Another interesting thing is about these sugar taxes. They actually put them on diet drinks too. So, anyhow, that's an example of something Adam Smith would not be in favor of. The next person we're going to talk about is a fascinating man, and it certainly is something that is relevant to our times. His name is Caesar Basiria. And his main concept here is, look, if we state that people have natural rights to life, liberty, and property, then the purpose of our system of justice needs to be relooked at, because the way people were punished back then was very brutal. I mean, if you were accused of a crime in many places, they could just indefinitely detain you. I mean, you wouldn't have to be brought to a trial. They could just keep you in a dungeon until you died of old age or sickness. And did they need witnesses? And you could also threaten witnesses, and you could threaten the person to make confessions and all these things. And Basiria says, well, this is stupid. Wait a minute. If we have natural rights, then even when someone's accused of a crime, they do not cede those rights. And you can see all of this in his book on crime and punishments. So he goes, look, we have to have laws. Laws are required. He agrees with the social contract. But he says if we're going to have laws, the purpose of the laws, we should focus on order. Order, not to punish people. Punishment is necessary, right? But it's not to sit there and hurt people. The purpose is to prevent other people from committing the same crime. So he says, here are the ones that he focuses on. He says, look, we should not be able to torture people into confessing against themselves, or torture witnesses and make them confess to something someone may or may not have done. He says you have to have speedy trials. I can't have a king accuse someone of a crime and then not bring them up on trial for 50 years while they get moldy in a dungeon somewhere. And then he also says, look, the punishment has to fit the crime. If someone steals something, you shouldn't cut their head off. You can see these in the 6th, 7th, and specifically the 8th Amendment of the Constitution. Specifically the 8th Amendment. Our 8th Amendment of the Constitution says this. It says you cannot have excessive fines, and you can't have cruel and unusual punishments. Our government is forbidden from having unique and strange and weird punishments on you. The purpose, because, remember, you have natural rights. The purpose of the law is to keep order, not to hurt people. The way I would help you remember the 8th Amendment of the Constitution for the rest of your life is I would ask you, would it be strange, say you committed a crime, if the government had trained an octopus to have a knife, a scalpel in all 8 of its 8 arms, and then its punishment was that octopus gets to slice you open for hours and hours and hours a day with its 8 arms? Would that be cruel? Yes. Would that be unusual? Yeah, it's an octopus with a bunch of scalpels. I want you to remember, so when you think of 8th Amendment, I want you to think about the octopus with a weapon in each hand. But this also, Basiria is also seen in the 6th and the 7th Amendments, which deal with accusations against a criminal. Voltaire, oh my, Voltaire would not do well in the age, in the social media age. So Voltaire said, well, there's this quote that's associated with him. It's, I do not agree with what a word you say, but I would defend to the death your right to say it. From Voltaire's view, and he may not have actually said that, but from his perspective, he fought very much for freedom of speech, religion, freedom of the press, allow people to reason through things. Voltaire thought in this very classic way that transparency, let people speak out loud what they're thinking, and then let's work through it using our minds. Don't tell people what they can and can't say. And that's what that quote really is about. It's about saying, hey, I hate what you say, but I'll defend it to the death. I believe it was Thomas Jefferson who made this point. Popular speech does not need anyone to defend it. It's popular. The purpose of the First Amendment is to protect unpopular speech. It's the stuff people don't want to hear. Popular things require no defender. They require no champion. You have to allow people to say what they're thinking. And this absolutely is influenced in our First Amendment of the Constitution, which, by the way, has 5 parts. So let's prep you for that. What are they? Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of the press, freedom to petition the government, and freedom to gather and to assemble. So there they are. Voltaire. The next one is something that when you hear it, you're like, oh yeah, that's, who cares? The next one is a guy named Diderot. And Diderot creates this thing called the encyclopedia. And maybe today it seems like it's outdated, but I would actually tell you we only have today because of it. Diderot says, look, we can have all these brilliant thinkers thinking about all these smart and intelligent things, but the reality of the situation is that if there's no place that people can find these thoughts, then we're not really having them. So he creates this thing called the encyclopedia. It is a set of books. It's a collection of books that have all these thoughts, all these new philosophies and new beliefs, and all the information that people are learning about the world and natural laws and reason and these principles of thought. And they're putting it in one collection, A through Z. And so now, you might want to know about, hey, why is slavery wrong? What are the challenges to the divine right of kings? How many years ago did Jesus Christ die? These are like, if you want to know anything, you could go to this one centralized source and get information. Now people go to the internet or Wikipedia or whatever, but none of that exists without this concept of like one place that we can go and we can get information. So then if I want to study more and go beyond that, I can see the encyclopedia will tell you where you go to get more information, but it's a starting point. It gives a foundational point where people can start applying these thoughts to their own lives and their own base of knowledge. And so, yeah, I put on there, was against slavery and the divine right of kings. You can start to read some of those philosophical ruminations about that. Now, so we're going to talk about the spreading of Enlightenment ideas. So ideas are, in many ways, almost like a virus, right? Like ideas spread from person to person, and they can spread very quickly, and they can be amazing, or they can be super dangerous and lethal. But the Enlightenment starts to spread. So where do they spread from? The capital of the Enlightenment, I would say, is Paris, France. Paris, of course, is the capital of France. At this time, Paris, I would say, is an ancient city at this point. And the thing about Paris is there's a lot of money going through Paris. It's a very old city, but the thing is there's a lot of intellectuals in Paris. And so when people want to study about these new ideas, when they want to learn about them, they go to Paris. They go there and they learn these ideas, and then when they go back home, they take the ideas with them. So Paris is like ground zero for the Enlightenment. And it's not going to be a coincidence that next chapter is the French Revolution, and much of that starts in Paris, right? These ideas, good or bad, gentlemen, have consequences. And it's all going to start with Paris. A salon, not to be confused with a saloon, is a social gathering where philosophers exchange ideas. These would be gatherings in Paris where different people would go, and they would go there to listen to people debate and discuss and tell other people what they've been learning and all the literature that they've been hearing or the different speakers. And so I want you to imagine like what this might look like. This would be, people would be invited off into very nice homes, and people would dress up. And in theory, inside the salon, everyone's equal. You're being judged by the quality of your ideas and how interesting you are and how you present them. And then other people would come up and they would debate those people. And you would eat foods and listen to music. It's kind of a really cool idea. And so this is like when again, like if we're likening the Enlightenment to a virus, this would be like the place where there's like the infections occurring. And I don't want to use it as a negative thing because many of these ideas are wonderful ideas, but the idea is this is where people are getting this, and now they're going to take it with them as they leave. So these modern day people that are spreading these ideas start to call themselves philosophes. And yes, it sounds very similar to philosopher. And basically it means the same thing. These are Enlightenment thinkers who use reason to create reforms within their society, reforms within their religious institutes, within their education systems, within their governments, within their economic systems. There is a feeling during the Enlightenment that there are no boundaries, that humans can do and change any institutions, which again, some of these changes are great and some of these are terrible. You have a lot of extreme ideas, and some of them are great, but like some have serious consequences. But these, again, these folks call themselves the philosophes, the modern philosophers. They're the modern Socrates and Plato and Aristotle. Okay, so who's the opposition to the Enlightenment? Change is not good or bad necessarily. You can have bad change and you can have good change. And so it always just depends on what the change is. There's two major groups that are against the Enlightenment. One is the church and one is the state. When I say state, I mean the monarchs of Europe. And they both believe they have a duty to defend what's called the old order, or another word to say it is the ancien regime, the ancient regime. And so they say, look, we have to protect the way things are. Now, we have this modern view that like any change is good. That's from the perspective of these institutions. Consider this, like from the church's perspective, or even the monarchs. Hey, where were you philosophes when the Dark Ages had started, when Rome collapsed, when there was no one teaching people how to read and write, when there was no one there to know the secrets of agriculture, when there was no one there to protect, to build roads, to build orphanages, to build hospitals? Where were you when Europe needed armies and they needed to be built up to defend from outside invaders? You weren't there. So you don't get a say now and tell us how we're going to change our society because you don't understand. You're just new young upstarts. You were not there through all the destruction and the raping and the torturing and the mass influx of one group after another. No. So, do they have a point? Sure they do. Is that also a justification not to change things? Absolutely. So it's just one of those interesting parts of history. You have to hear both sides. And the big question is, what are the changes they're proposing? And I'd say again, some of them are good and some are not. So today you guys would call this canceling. Enlightenment thinkers face what's called censorship. Censorship is the restricting of ideas by burning books, arresting authors, exiling them, or just killing them. In the modern sense, you guys have this. It's canceling, right? We have this idea that we can just ban someone from society. There are some people in our society that have actually their banks canceled them. Said you can't have banking anymore. Oh, and you're not allowed on social media, and they lose their jobs. That's censorship, right? Now, that is what was occurring during the Enlightenment. Some of the monarchs, some of the church officials said, well, like if the way we're going to stop this is get to the root is by getting to the people that are starting this. We're just going to get rid of them. We'll exile them. We'll destroy their books. We'll even murder some of them. The thing about that though is it's not necessarily very efficient, right? Because once a thought is spoken, you can't see it. It's out there. And so that's what starts to happen. And some of the people that are made martyrs of, right? Because, their thoughts must have some validity because there's people fighting against them. So here's one students struggle with. And because this term is not one that is used in modern parlance, modern speech, it's called a despot. There are some of the Enlightenment leaders that are called enlightened despots. A despot is a monarch. It's a powerful person that can do whatever they want to do. Some of the despots, the monarchs, start to be called enlightened. And the reason why is they start using parts of the Enlightenment within the frameworks of their governments. Now, they're not necessarily doing this because they're nice people or they truly believe in the Enlightenment. Some did. But other ones are using it because, guess what? It prevents them from losing power. If my people are a fan of this, why don't I just take the parts of the Enlightenment that help me retain power? Oh, you want to have freedom of religion? Well, if that doesn't get in the way of my rule, I'll give it to you. You want to have some freedom of speech? Maybe I'll give you that. And by doing that, it actually creates some loyalty. Some people within the society then say, well, no, my monarch's better than yours. My monarch gives us this freedom or this privilege or this responsibility. Also, monarchs use it because it makes their countries run better. Like, it allows for especially economies to be more efficient and to allow the distribution of resources to areas that require them, which is really what politics is. So some do it simply from self-interest, some do it for interest of country. But these people, the example I would give you is Catherine the Great, who was a reformer in Russia, that certainly utilized some Enlightenment ideas. Now, there's a backlash against her for this, but that is what this concept means. Now, the thing is, revolutions don't just change like the power structures of a society. They change everything, including the culture, which then affects the art. But by the way, art also affects the culture, which can also institute revolutions or help encourage them or dissuade them. And so during the Enlightenment, write this down, there's a revolution in art. And you can start to see what happens with the music and the art. It starts to become very different. It starts to attenuate to what the folks of this era like. The person I would give you, I've not talked much about music so far in this class. The person I would give you for music is Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. And I don't always tell you to listen to the links here. You need to listen to this song that I have connected to give you an idea of like how this is such a revolution. Mozart was a child prodigy, and by that I mean he was an absolute genius from the time he was a little kid. And Mozart, in his lifetime, wrote 600 operas, symphonies, religious songs, but really it's the way his music sounds. And it starts to influence and inspire people, and there's a shifting of the way people listen to music. The example I would give you is that link is a great one. It's the Magic Flute. It's awesome. It's really powerful. It's beautiful the way he envision the way music and the way vocals could interact with each other. And the Magic Flute is a part of his one of his operas. An opera is a play, but it is sung all the way through, so it's very challenging to write. So Amadeus Mozart, really important person. And to be honest, he was so popular his entire life. That's him as just a little boy, like a toddler. This is him when he's probably 7, 8, 9. There's a painting of him. Here's a painting of him. Michael, he's your age now, right? This would be about his high school era, and then even late in life. And he was beloved because of the way he hits the music scene in Europe. All right, the last thing I'm gonna cover in this unit is how this revolution transpires into painted art. And there's two major types of art that you need to understand, and one is called Baroque. Baroque literally means, when it's translated, to grand style. Part of that is due to the fact that many of these paintings are gigantic. I mean like 10 feet, 12 feet. They're huge. When you look at a Baroque painting, you should be able to identify it just by the way it looks, right? So they're large images. Thematically, they're dealing with religion, they're dealing with violence, there's battles, there's mythology. There's one of those themes generally, unless they're a self-portrait. They use really, when I say dark colors, I mean rich colors. Baroque uses these colors that are very bold in the way they look. So let's look at this here. This is the child Jesus being brought to the temple. You can see it's religious thematically. When you look at the reds in the image, they're very rich. Look how dark that red is. Here's an example of a Baroque self-portrait, which is not going to be, I'm not going to show as many of these, but you can see again, another facet of these is how much of the picture is actually the people. Like that girl makes up, I don't know, like 70% of what's available in the frame. And look at the color, dark, rich. In this case, somber as well. Here's another example, right? This is the ascension of Mary to heaven. You've got, again, we have a religious theme here, right? You've got dark colors. The people make up, because this is Enlightenment. They're becoming more interested in humans, and this is post-humanism. So the people of the frame, there's not a lot of background. It's all about the people. And you see Mary takes up a big chunk of the real estate. There's dark colors everywhere. It's religiously thematic. Here's an example. This is the Battle of Armageddon here. This is mythological. Look at the horses in here. Even the horses have like six-pack abs. The people are gigantic. They're thick. They're huge. There's action. The color's dark. So again, violence, mythology, religion, and the coloring. And the size gives it away. Okay, here's an example. Here's a mythological, right? We've got the Gorgon, Medusa. Her head's been cut off. Look at the level of detail, right? You've got all this viscous and blood and meat coming out, snakes going in every direction. Her face takes up a huge percentage of the actual real estate. And there's scorpions and spiders and blood, violence, right? That's a key part of when you're looking at a Baroque image. So here's another one, right? So now we have a scene from the Bible. I believe it's is it Ruth? She sneaks into this. This is Old Testament. Sneaks into this general's tent at night, and she cuts his head off. She cuts his head off, right? She takes her knife and she saws his head off. Look at the picture. Look at the colors. Look how rich they are. Even has this arterial spray, right? It's spraying blood out while he's screaming. And look at the look on her face. She's just going to work, right? It's just Tuesday for her. She's just cutting heads off. Hey, by the way, here's another of the same image. Different artist. Same moment in the Bible, right? She's yanking his hair. She's working him. The old lady's like, yeah, stick him. Stick him. Cut that head off. Get it off. Here's another image. This is interesting. Same image. This one was done by a female artist. This one's done by a female artist. Same moment. She's driving that sword down into his neck. Blood spraying. The table's covered in blood. Blood everywhere. There's another lady forcing it down. So Baroque, dark paintings, large paintings, violence, mythology, religion, all are on display. Now let's go ahead and take a look at the other art style this time. Okay, so this is Rococo. Rococo is interesting because actually these paintings are often very small. They don't have to be, but they're often very small and they're highly detailed. Like if you look at the level of detail in these images, there's lots of tiny details. They use the same colors, but they're lighter now. Today we'd almost say like they're pastel. They're lighter colors. There's very little religion in these. You might see things like cupids and angels, which represent sexuality, love, lust, those types of things, but it's not really about biblical themes. They're not serious. They're intended to be unimportant, right? They're elegant in their detail. I mean, look at the level of look at the cloth in that image and all the folds in the robes. And there's almost always a strong emphasis on love or sexuality. They're very focused on that. And even in this image, you've got these three women. They're just sitting there talking, and the one woman's their dresses are low cut on the top. You've got some angels looking in, which means they're probably having a conversation about love. Here's another one. Now these colors are a little richer, but you see lots of fine details. It's this image again. You've got cupids here. She's partially unclothed. Classic Rococo. This image here is probably the most classical Rococo image you can find. So this one, which I think was called The Affair. So what you have here is you have these two people that are flirting. And they're in the woods. You see all these beautiful fine details of all the flowers, right? There's all these flowers misting, and she's on a swing, and she's swinging up over him, and she's kicking her leg up, and her dress is coming up, and he's looking up there, and her shoes flying off. And if you look in the image, the Cupid is actually making eye contact with her, and she's looking down at him. There's like a dark shape in the background, which kind of shows that there may be her husband or her betrothed is onlooking, but like it's less serious. This is really about love or sexuality or courting, those types of things. You can also see those cupids in the bottom right there looking up as well. Another image, lots of cupids, lots of people, everyone's pairing off, finding their true love. There's cupids flying through the skies, lots of tiny details on the grass and in the trees. Everything's really well done.